Good evening. It's 8 o'clock in Yerushalayim. This is WebYeshiva.org, and it's time to begin our regular series of shiurim in halacha. We're talking about astrology, and we've seen different approaches in favor, against, medium road. We've seen many approaches to the whole theory of astrology. Last time we left off with looking at, let's see if I can get on the screen here. Last time we ended with the Divrei Torah of the Munkatcher Rebbe. Let's just review the two principal points that we learned at the end of last week's class, and then we'll continue with new material right away. We learned, number one, that the first idea that we learned was called to kapid, kapdinen ba'adeh. As long as we're talking about mystical dangers, not physical dangers, mystical dangers affect primarily those people who are worried about them. If you don't worry about it, so it's not going to harm you. There are problems which, if you ignore them, will go away, and those are primarily problems of a mystical or skuli, mystical nature. If you don't care about the problem, it won't affect you, and therefore, he came to his conclusion, you should orient your life, you should structure your life so that everything you do is oriented towards the fulfillment of Torah and mitzvahs. If your whole life is structured around Torah and mitzvahs, even while you are engaged in commerce, even while you are earning your livelihood, whatever it is you're doing, you have in mind that you are doing it so that you can proceed in the enterprise of Torah and mitzvahs, then you will not be worried about the mystical dangers in the world. You will be tamim, im Hashem, you will be pure with God and depend upon God, and the mystical dangers simply will not affect you. You'll be immune. You'll be immune to them as long as your life is structured along the path of Torah and mitzvahs. That's what the Divrei Torah, that's what the Munkatcher said last week. And you remember, he was one of the all-time greats, both in the area of halacha and in the area of Kabbalah and in the area of mysticism. Well, his opinion is very important. Now I want to take this idea, which he taught us, and go one step further by asking the question, is this the unique idea of one of the great rabbis? And as interesting as it may be, does not represent a mainstream approach? Or is this idea of the Munkatcher Rebbe, that orienting your life in a way that you are structured around Torah and mitzvahs, and therefore you will not be bothered, you will not concern yourself with the mystical dangers? Is this represent a mainstream approach? Is this a mainstream approach which is embraced by other great Kabbalists, by other great mystics? Let's look at, again on the screen here, let's look at the next source. The next source is the Tiferes Tzvi. The Tiferes Tzvi was written by Rav Tzadok HaKohen. Let me get him spelled correctly on chat. Rabbi Tzadok HaKohen, the great Rav of Lublin, Eastern Europe, mid-19th century. Now, Rabbi Tzadok was one of the intellectual leaders of the Hasidic movement in Poland. In addition, he was one of the great Kabbalists. He was one of the great mystics of the 19th century. And in addition, he happened to also be Talmud Chacham, a rabbinic scholar in the yeshiva sense of the word. He was a formidable yeshiva scholar as well. He is also one of these personalities, like the Munkatcher Rebbe, who combined in a single person greatness in Hasidic, Kabbalistic literature together with greatness in traditional yeshiva learning. Now, his works his commentary on the Torah and his other works are to this very day fundamental works for anyone who wants to have an understanding of Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, and Hasidus, Hasidic doctrines in specific. Let's see what he says about our issue. What he's talking about specifically is the question of meat and fish being eaten together. Everyone knows that the Torah prohibits mixing meat and milk, but what about meat and fish? Well, it's easy enough to put together a long list of sources in the Gemara, in rabbinic literature, so at the length and breadth of rabbinic literature, it's easy enough to put together a very long list of sources saying that if you eat a mixture of meat and fish together, that is sakana, that is dangerous, and the danger is a mystical one. So now he's very concerned about this question, and here is what he has to say about it. And his ideas, as he's about to explain, his ideas pertain not only to the mystical danger of meat and fish mixed together. As he's about to explain, his ideas apply equally to all other mystical dangers. For example, the dangers of the stars. Here is what he says. Sometimes we apply the principle of Shomer Psoim Hashem. Sometimes we apply the principle which we learned on the previous screen, that if you are engaged in Torah and mitzvahs, the engagement in Torah and mitzvahs will protect you, and you need not be concerned about dangers. Sometimes we say that. When do we say that the engagement in Torah and mitzvahs will protect you? Hainu, namely, kishadashu bo kol adam, in a situation where everyone out there is doing it. You know, it's impossible to lead your life without entering into dangerous situations. Just crossing the street, even if you cross correctly on the crosswalk when the little green man lights up, even if you do everything correctly, it's still dangerous. You can still be run over by a crazy driver. It's just impossible to get through the day without encountering dangerous situations. But if the dangerous situation is one where everyone is doing the same activity, you too are allowed to do it. In the words of the Gemara, which he just quoted, Dashu bo hakol, in a place where the multitude tread, where everyone else is going, you too are allowed to go, even though there is danger. Well, there's danger everywhere in the world. There's nothing free of danger in this world. What everyone else is doing, you too are allowed to do. Aval, however, Masha Dashu ba rak amei haaretz, things which only the amei haaretz, the uneducated Jews are doing. The Talmidei Chachamim, and the educated Jews, Zihirim, are careful not to do it, something which only uneducated people do. But people who are educated know that's dangerous, and therefore they refrain from it. Lo mikre dashu rabin, that's not called everyone is doing it. In order to say everyone is engaged in a dangerous activity and therefore I can do it too, it must be something that even educated people do. Just getting in a car and driving from Yerushalayim to Tel Aviv is a life-threatening experience. People really get killed every day on the roads. The number of automobile accidents is just horrible, horrible, horrible. People really die on the roads. It is really life-threatening. Doesn't mean you're not allowed to get in a car and drive from Yerushalayim to Tel Aviv. You have to do so prudently. You have to put on a seatbelt. You're not allowed to drive recklessly. You have to drive prudently. But the residue of danger, even if you are prudent, Even if you put on your seatbelt and drive carefully, the residue of danger, which is always there, and the most careful drivers can be killed on the road, the residue of danger is okay because everyone is doing it, even educated people. Ho'il ve'ena olam nizharim, in cases where no one refrains from a certain kind of activity, like driving to Tel Aviv, crossing the street in the correct way. Things which everyone is doing. I suppose he says, there's some kind of tradition that we've received that these activities are okay. Oh, I'll call panim in any event. Einem zihirim v'lo shamanu nezek. We don't see a lot of danger. We don't see a lot of damage in these cases. Zel raya de'enu matzuya. Perhaps the dangers are very rare and we're permitted to ignore them. Hu atam b'kulhu de'ena olam zihirim. Well, all of this has to do with things out there that even educated Jews do not refrain from, things which even educated Jews engage in. Kach Kabbalah biyadi, and I have a tradition which I have learned from my masters, he says, all the kinds of foodstuffs which have mystical dangers to them, fish and meat, food which has been underneath the bed, peeled onions which have stayed overnight. There's a long list of foodstuffs which are mystically dangerous. Regarding all of them, nowadays, we don't have to care about these issues. The evil spirits which affected these foodstuffs, the evil spirits which infected these foodstuffs, which were under the bed or the peeled onions or whatever it is, those evil spirits were common in antiquity, in the days of the Gemara, but nowadays these evil spirits are not around so much, and therefore we need not be so concerned. Habalishol, anyone who comes to ask a question, and now we get to the key point in this tshuva, anyone who comes to ask a question, anyone who comes to the rabbi and says, Rabbi, the meat and the fish got mixed together, what should I do? Rabbi, the food was under the bed, what should I do? Rabbi, the onion was peeled and stayed on the table overnight. Rabbi, what should I do? Someone who comes and asks a question about one of these mystical dangers that attaches to certain foodstuffs, it's clear that this person is worried about it. If he wasn't worried about it, he wouldn't have asked. The questioner, is worried about this. If he were not worried, he wouldn't have asked the rabbi what to do. The very fact that he asks the question is sufficient proof that the problem bothers him. He's worried about the mystical danger. And since he's worried about the mystical danger will damage him. You have nothing to fear but fear itself. If you are afraid of the mystical danger, then you will be damaged. If you are afraid of the mystical danger, then you will be injured. It's the fear which will hurt you. It is the fear which will harm you. It is the fear which will injure you. And therefore, what the rabbi should do is make up a solution to the problem, invent a solution to the problem. The rabbi should tell him, oh, the food was under the bed. Yes, indeed. You are right to be concerned about that. You're right to be nervous about that. Evil spirits attach to the food which is under the bed. What you should do is take that food, tie it up in a bundle, and put it in the chimney in your house and smoke it for a while. Let the smoke from the chimney smoke the food. Nowadays, our smoked foods are made commercially in smokehouses or artificially. They just put in some chemicals to give it a smoked taste. But back in those days, people were smoking their own food at home. You just put the cheese in the chimney, and it comes out smoked cheese the next day. Tell the questioner who is bothered, tell the questioner who is worried about the mystical danger, smoke the food, smoke it. שזהו דרך סגולה המקובל ביד ההמון שמועיל להעברת לוחות לאות. Because if you tell him to smoke it, you can convince him that smoking the food will drive out the evil spirits. Smoke the food, you'll drive out the evil spirits from the food, and then you'll be able to do it. Well, if you can convince the questioner that smoking the food will drive out the evil spirits, you will succeed in eliminating his fear. You will succeed in eliminating his worry and his concern. And then he'll no longer care, and he'll eat the food. The dangers affect only those people who are worried about them. If you can figure out a way to cancel this person's concern, his worry about the mystical danger will vanish. Nothing more need be done. That is quite sufficient to deal with the problem. Kach kibalti. That is the mystical tradition which I have received from my masters. Unlike the opinions of some rabbis who are very strict on these matters, and if someone asks them a question regarding mystical danger in the food or whatever it is, some rabbis just say, throw out the food and don't dare consider eating it. But Rav Tzadok HaKohen, one of the greatest of the Hasidic and Kabbalistic masters of the 19th century, is falling in line exactly with the path which was delineated for us by the Munkacher Rebbe last week, namely, if you can eliminate the fear, if you can eliminate the concern and the worry from your mind, the danger will evaporate. The way to eliminate the concern, the way to eliminate the worry and the fear from your mind. Last week, in the words of the Munkacher Rebbe, was structure your life, orient your life in a way that everything you do is oriented towards the fulfillment of Torah and mitzvahs, and that should cure you of your fear. That should cure you of your worry. Our rabbi today, Reb Tzadok HaKohen, recommends that the rabbi think of some tahpula, some trick to eliminate the fear from the mind of the questioner, and all is well. Therefore, if someone comes to the rabbi and says, Rabbi, according to astrological signs, I am in danger of this or I am in danger of that, the two approaches which we've seen to solve this problem, to deal with it, number one, the approach of the Munkacher Rebbe. Try to explain to the person who is worried that if he or she will structure his life or her life in a way that everything is oriented to Torah and mitzvahs, then all will be well, and you need not worry about the danger of the astrological predictions which you have heard about. Second approach, that of Reb Tzadok HaKohen, think of some other trick, think of some other way to eliminate the concern, to eliminate the worry, to eliminate the fear from the mind of the person who is concerned, and all will be well. Okay, with this in mind, what I want to do now is turn to an example of the way astrological. Oh dear! I want to turn to an example of the way the astrological literature treats various issues. The example I've chosen is from the Sefer Or Einayim. Sefer Or Einayim was written by Reb Shlomo ben Avraham Paniel, one of the greatest of the astrologers of the 15th century. And the reason I've chosen this particular Sefer to quote from is that this is surely the most popular astrological handbook which has ever been written in the rabbinic world. Let's see how he approaches things, and we will have our eyes illuminated, I hope. Here goes. Purim is coming up soon, and after Purim is going to be Pesach. So I chose the section of the Sefer which deals with Pesach to present to you this evening. Here goes. Hamitzrim, the Egyptians, back in the days when the Jews were enslaved in Egypt, the Egyptians, the Heyotam Chachamim Gedolim, the Egyptians back in those days were very wise people. It was a very wise nation, the Inyan HaKochavim, as far as astrology is concerned. Astrology was a science which was very carefully studied in Egypt back in the days of the Pharaoh, back in the days when the Jews were enslaved in Egypt. And those Egyptian astrologers, the Egyptian astrologers saw when they looked at the celestial bodies, when they looked at the constellations, they saw Hozek Ma'adim. They saw the strength of the planet Mars. Uma'alato. They saw that Mars was going to be ascendant, Ba'elafahu, during that 1,000-year period, during that millennium, during the 1,000-year period, during which the Jews were enslaved in Egypt, the ascendance of Mars, the red planet, was going to be supreme. This they saw in the stars. Kigam Sham, Yechuyav, Sheva Shnei Ra'av, Lechalot et Artzam, and therefore the astrologers among the Egyptians understood that because Mars was ascendant, and we know from our previous studies, we don't know a lot about Mars, but one of the things we know about Mars from our previous studies earlier in this series, that we know that Mars is a planet of evil influence. It's a planet of very bad influence, and therefore the astrologers of Egypt in those days understood perfectly that they were in for 7 years of famine which would destroy their country. They understood that they were living in very dangerous times because they understood that Mars, Ma'adim, was ascendant. Okay, therefore, Shavu Mitzrim La'avodas Oto Kochav, and therefore the Egyptians turned to idolatry, and the Egyptians began to worship the planet Mars, begging the planet Mars, beseeching the planet Mars not to injure them, not to harm them, not to bring 7 years of famine upon them. Lakhuoto Elohim, they took the planet Mars as one of their gods. There were a lot of gods back in those days, but one of them was the planet Mars because they wanted to pray to Mars so that Mars would not affect them. Now, this means that Hayu Ovdim, it follows, therefore, that they were worshiping Mazal Tle. It follows, therefore, that they were worshiping the constellation of stars, which is in Hebrew called Tle, the ram. In English, that constellation is called Aries. Why? Right? Aries is the Latin word for a ram, or an animal. Why were they worshiping that constellation of stars? Shahu Beit Ma'adim. That's the constellation of stars which constitutes the house of Mars. And since they were in terror of the influence of Mars, that is the constellation, or the ram, the Tle, which they worshipped. They wanted to have no evil influence upon themselves. They wanted the bad influence of Aries and Mars not to fall upon Egypt. Now, the constellation Aries is one of the smaller. It's one of the smaller constellations in the sky. It lies in the first quadrant of the northern hemisphere. You can get a map of the celestial bodies. I'm sure Wikipedia will provide you with a map of the northern hemisphere skies, and you can find where Aries is in the sky. It's in the first quadrant. Back in those days, back in the days of Babylonia, back in the days of ancient Egypt, back in the early days of antiquity, the constellation of Aries contained, among other things, the equinox. Right, the equinox is that day of the year where day and night are of equal length, the equinox. That's the point where the sun crosses the celestial equator. Just like we have an equator around the Earth, there's a celestial equator as well. And when the sun crosses the celestial equator, that is the equinox, and that is where Aries is located. Now, it was true back in those days. Crossing the equinox, crossing the celestial equator, that's the day of the equinox, when day and night are of equal length. This is a very important day in the course of the year from the astrological point of view, because from that day, it's coming up next month. From that day on, the days get longer and the nights get shorter. Up until that day, the days are getting shorter. Then you have day and night equal in length, and then the days start getting longer after the equinox. That, therefore, from the astrological point of view, is the beginning of the astrological year. And this, of course, back in those days, fell in the month of Nisan. Let's see what we're talking about. Aries, the constellation of the Ram, has this red symbol. The red symbol is the symbol which astrologers use for the constellation of Aries. It's supposed to look a little bit like a ram. You know what rams really look like? Here's a picture of a real ram. A narrow head, horns in a specific shape. That's what a ram looks like. And therefore, the constellation of the Ram, the constellation of Tle, or Aries, has this astrological symbol which looks like the head of the Ram, narrow head with the horns. Now, that constellation governs that month of the year where the equinox is going to fall. From that day on, days get longer. That is the beginning of the astrological year. And back in those days, that was also Chodesh Nisan. As you know, Chodesh Nisan, the month of Nisan, the month of Pesach, is the first year of the Jewish calendar. Tishrei is the first year only for governmental matters, but for spiritual matters. And when the Torah itself doesn't use any names for the months of the year. The Torah itself talks about the first month, the second month, the third month. The first month is what we call the month of Nisan. That's the month of Aries. That's the month that was the month of the equinox. The problem with all of this is that the earth has shifted since antiquity. Back in those days, the equinox, the beginning of the year, did indeed fall under the house of Aries. But nowadays things have changed. The reason things have changed is because the Earth is not only revolving around its axis, not only does the world revolve around its axis, but the axis itself is wobbling a little bit. That's called precession. Is very slow. We are moving the axis quickly, but the axis is wobbling very slowly. And as the axis of the Earth wobbles, the position of the constellation in the sky moves. And therefore, today, the equinox no longer falls under Aries. Today, the equinox falls under Pisces. Pisces is the next month. This is Pisces. Pisces is the month of the fish. That's supposed to look like two fish, I think. Pisces is the month of the fish, and today the equinox falls in Pisces. The equinox is moved because the axis of the Earth has slowly wobbled since the days of Babylonia and ancient Egypt, and therefore all the constellations have shifted, and therefore today the equinox no longer falls in Aries as it did then, but rather in Pisces in a different month. Well, why is all of this significant? Well, why is all this significant? Back then, the equinox fell in Aries. Aries is the house of Mars. Mars was the bad influence which was going to cause the plagues, and therefore the famine. Mars was the bad influence that was going to cause the famine, and therefore they began to worship those stars. They were deluded. They thought that by worshiping those stars, they could save themselves from the 7 years of famine. They were so certain that worshiping those stars in the proper way would save them. They were confident. They lost their fear of the years of famine. They were perfectly confident that if they worshipped those stars in the proper way, all would be well. They lost their fear. Lo ratzu l'shloach et Yisrael, and therefore they refused to free the Jewish people. Moshe Rabbeinu explains to them that if you would free the Jewish people, if you would send us out of Egypt so we can return to Eretz Yisrael, then God will stop the plagues. Well, they thought they had a better solution to the problem. They thought they had a better solution. Who cares about what God wants? They thought what's important is appeasing Mars and the constellation of Aries. Let us worship them. And they thought their worship would save them. Now the Ore 9 continues and says as follows. Hashem Baruch Hu, God, on the other hand, wanted Ratzah Legolet Yisrael B'chozek HaKochavahu. God wanted to use the influence of those stars to save the Jewish people. Not only did God want to save the Jewish people, but he wanted to do it through the influence of exactly those stars, which the Egyptians thought were going to save them. God wanted to show the Egyptians that they were all wrong. The Egyptians thought they got the stars on their good side. According to their wisdom, according to their theory of astrology, they thought that they could enslave the Jewish people forever if only they would keep worshiping that constellation and that planet, Aries and Mars. Eloka, the true God, Shehu Maromerumim, who is higher than all heights, the true God who is above and beyond all astrology, Gavoa al kol gvohim, higher than the highest heights, the true God, who tziva Yisrael, HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave the Jewish people mitzvah acheret gedola. God gave the Jewish people a special mitzvah. God gave the Jewish people a special big mitzvah, a great mitzvah, milvad hamila, in addition to circumcision, in addition to bris milah, an additional mitzvah to protect the Jewish people against the influence of Mars. What is bris milah all about? What is circumcision all about? Circumcision, if you read the verses in the Torah, you'll find that the verses in the Torah emphasize the importance of blood, dam, bris, the blood of the covenant, Much of what circumcision, bris milah, is all about is dam, is blood. By performing the mitzvah of bris milah, the Jewish people are protected against the influence of the red star, the bloody star, the nefarious star, Mars. We call it a planet, they called it a star. That's why we have the mitzvah of bris milah, to protect us against the influence of Ma'adim. But that's not quite enough. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God gave us an additional special mitzvah for protection against Mars, V'hi Dam Pesach, the mitzvah of the Paschal Lamb. What did HaKadosh Baruch Hu command the Jewish people in Egypt? To slaughter the animal and to put the blood on their doorways. By putting the blood on their doorways, they were able to protect themselves against the influence of Mars. They had double protection: bris milah, circumcision, and also dam pesach, also the blood of the Paschal Lamb on their doorways. The emtzaut dam pesach, the dam milah, by means of these two red substances, the blood of circumcision and the blood of the Paschal sacrifice, Hotzi Hashem et Yisrael Mitzrayim, that gave the Jewish people the power. That's how God gave the Jewish people the power to be able to leave Egypt. Lo shalta behem al-marachai, and the evil influences of Mars and Aries could not affect the Jews. That is how he explains it. Now let's understand what's going on here. The most important point to observe is that he is using astrological doctrines not to predict the future. He is using astrological doctrines to explain the stories in the Torah. That's one very important point. The use of astrological wisdom in the Orenayim, and this is surely the most popular astrological handbook in rabbinic literature, the use of astrological wisdom here is very similar to the use of astrological wisdom throughout the literature, namely, to have an explanation, to give us some insight into why things happened in the past, how things happened in the past, to try to explain to us what it is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is doing, to give us an insight into the mechanisms, the mechanics by which HaKadosh Baruch Hu brought various miracles into the world. That's very different from using astrology to predict the future. To predict the future is what he's not doing. What he is doing is explaining the past. Now, why is he doing all this? What is his purpose in using astrological wisdom to explain the past? His purpose is, if you look carefully at his words, I'm sure you will agree, his purpose is to strengthen our resolve, to strengthen our commitment, to strengthen our attachment to the fulfillment of mitzvahs. Someone out there who is a little bit shaky about the importance of the mitzvah of bris milah, someone out there who is a little bit shaky, not quite certain that they want to go through with the mitzvah of bris milah, well, if you believe in the astrological approach, if you embrace the wisdom of astrology as he has explained it, of course you are going to run to fulfill the mitzvah of bris milah. Of course you are going to run to fulfill the mitzvah of circumcision, because that is going to provide you with protection against the evil influences of Mars and the constellation of the Ram. And now he's motivating us to attach ourselves more closely to Torah mitzvahs. He's not predicting the future. He's explaining the past, and he's explaining the past for the purpose of attaching for the purpose of leading the Jewish people today, well, back in his days, to lead the Jewish people who are so concerned with astrology, to lead those who are concerned with astrology into a better commitment, a better attachment to Torah and mitzvahs. That's what it's all about. What it's all about is Torah and mitzvahs, and if the astrological wisdom can lead you to a stronger attachment to Torah and mitzvahs, go for it. That's his approach. Let's go one step further in his writing. From all of this, we see that HaKadosh Baruch Hu accepted the influence of the stars. When HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world, when he created the universe in a way that the constellation of Aries and the planet Mars would have bad influences when they are ascendant. That is something which is built in to the fabric of creation when God created the universe. It is in the power of the planet Mars to bring much blood into the world. It is the power of the planet Mars, the red planet, to bring much suffering and much evil into the world. This is a power which God imbued in the planet Mars from the very first day of creation, well, the third day of creation. When God created the celestial bodies, he created in these planets the power to do bad things on earth. Okay, therefore, Shiva lehagia el hamashkof, and that's why God commanded the Jews in Egypt to take the blood of the Paschal sacrifice and place it on their doorways, on the mashkof, on the top of the doorways, the el shtei hamezuzot, and on the two side posts of the doorways. Lihiyot ha-mitzvah ta'ana neged ha-ma'aracha. The performance of God's mitzvah would be a defense against the evil influence, the harmful influence of those planets. Gam Yisrael Ovdei Hashem Shomrei Mitzvotav, the Jewish people, if they will fulfill the commandments of God, it's those commandments which will protect you from harm which comes from the stars. Yom Tzeitam Mitzrayim Hu Yom Shlishi. What day of the week did the Jews actually leave Egypt? The day of the week they left Egypt was a Tuesday, Yom Shlishi. They left on a Tuesday. Why on a Tuesday? Bo Sholek Ma'adim, or all of the 7 planets, what they call the 7 stars, what we call the 7 planets. Each of the 7 planets rules a specific day of the week. The day of the week, which is controlled by the planet Mars, is Tuesday. That's the day that the Egyptians were worshiping their idolatrous god, the planet of Mars, and that's the day that HaKadosh Baruch Hu took the Jewish people out of Egypt. Al Kain, Hashem Baruch Hu, Shehu Yodea Hasha'a V'Achiburahu. Therefore, God, who of course knew about the context and the confluence of those stars and constellations, God understood perfectly when he created the world that Tuesday was going to be the Tuesday when Mars is most influential, that Tuesday in that week, in that month, in that year, in that millennium, where the power of Mars would be greatest. That's the Tuesday he chose for the exodus from Egypt. And it says in the verse, Kechatzot alayla ani yotzei b'toch Mitzrayim. It says in the verse that God went out among the people at midnight on that Tuesday, midnight. L'hilachem neged hakoach hagadol ahu. God b'chavodo uva'atzmo. God himself fought against the evil influence of Mars on that day. The Mitzrim lo amda aleihem hochmatam. and the astrological wisdom of the Egyptians was foiled. The astrological wisdom of the Egyptians didn't help them in the slightest, because they were betuchim be'Eloheim. The Egyptians thought that it was their idolatrous worship of Mars that would save them and allow them to keep the Jews in slavery in perpetuity. But God had other plans, and he gave us the commandment of circumcision and the commandment of Dam Pesach in order to protect the Jews. And at midnight on that Tuesday, God went out among the people to protect them. He concludes by saying, Zesha Amar Yisro. Yisro, the father-in-law of Moshe Rabbeinu, says in the Torah, and these are the words of Yisro, the father-in-law of Moshe Rabbeinu. Ata yadati ki gadol Hashem mikol alim. Now I know that God is the greatest. When did Yisro? Yisro began life as an idolater, converted to Judaism. How did he know that God, the creator of the world, is the true God, greater than any idolatry? How did he know that? Rotzel Omar, he knew it, ki beheyot Yisro chacham gadol b'chochmat hakochavim. Since Yisro was one of the great astrologers of his generation, v'hu ra'ah chozek amazalahu. Yisro saw the strength and the power of Mars, which was ascendant in those days. And Yisro saw that the Egyptians also understood the power of Mars. That's why the Egyptians were worshiping Mars and offering sacrifices to Mars and so forth and so on. The Egyptians were so secure in their idolatry that they refused to release the Jewish people. And now that Yisro saw that God took the Jewish people out of Egypt despite the influence of Mars, despite the influence of Mars, when Yisro saw that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was powerful enough to foil the influence, to ruin and counter the influence of Mars, Amar, then Yisro said, Ata yadati ki gadol Hashem mikol shar kochos. Now I see that God is the greatest, and that God is more powerful than any of the stars. Hu yodei she'en b'chol kochot hashamayimiyot mi sheyimcher b'yad elokei Mitzrayim. The Yisro understood that none of the false gods of Egypt could stand up against the decision of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the creator of the world, the Sha'at, Shiatzi Yisrael Misham. And Yisro saw all this, understood all this, when he saw that the Jews left Egypt despite all of the astrological disadvantages which the Jewish people had. And he saw that what saved them were the special mitzvahs that God gave them. Similarly, all the other mitzvahs of the Torah are designed and oriented to protect you against specific bad influences of specific stars. If you want to be protected, then you must engage your life in Torah and mitzvahs. The more you are engaged in Torah and mitzvahs, the more you will be protected from the bad influence, not only of Mars, but of all the other astrological bad influences that exist. Now let me make one final comment, just to draw the material together a little bit. Sfas Emes. Sfas Emes was the Ger Rebbe, one of the Ger Rebbes. He's not the founder he's a grandson of the Chidushei HaRim. The Chidushei HaRim was the founder of the Gur movement, the Ger Hasidim. The grandson was one of the great Hasidic Rebbes. He wrote the Sefer called the Sfas Emes, which remains to this day one of the most important Hasidic Sfarim. He explains the Midrash as follows. First, I'll tell you what the Midrash says, and then I'll give you the explanation of the Sfas Emes. It says in the Midrash that Yisro, the father-in-law of Moshe Rabbeinu, said to Moshe, before he got married, before he became the father-in-law, Yisro said to his prospective son-in-law, he said, Moshe, young man, you want to marry my daughter? That's okay. I will give you the hand of my daughter in marriage with one condition. The one condition which Yisro insisted upon, Yisro, the great astrologer, and he was before converting to Judaism, one of the great priests of idolatry in those days. Yisro said to his prospective son-in-law, I will agree to allow you to marry my daughter with one condition, namely, the first son who is born of your union, my first grandson, your first son, must be raised as an idolater. If you agree to raise your first son, my first grandson, as an idolater, then I will allow you to marry my daughter. Now that's what it says in the Midrash. And this is a little bit bizarre. This is a little bit bizarre because at the time of the marriage, Yisro had already converted to Judaism. At the time of the marriage, Yisro had already abandoned idolatry. At the time of the marriage, what sense does it make that Yisro, who had become a Torah-observant Jew, what sense does it make that Yisro would have wanted his grandson, Moshe's first son, to be raised as an idolater? It's a bizarre, absolutely bizarre midrash. The explanation of the midrash, according to the Sfas Emes, is as follows. There are many great tzaddikim in the world, many great rabbis. And each of the great rabbis, each of the tzaddikim in the world today has his own derech avodah. Each of the great rabbis, each of the great tzaddikim has his own path in serving God. Some great tzaddikim live lives of poverty, and any money that comes into their hands, they give away for charity. Other great rabbis, other great tzaddikim are occupied deeply in prayer. Prayer is the fundamental element of their service of God. Other great tzaddikim, their service of God, their derech avodah, their path in serving God is paved with the paving stones of Talmudic erudition. They study Gemara day and night. There are many tzaddikim out there. There are many great rabbis, and each has his own derech. Each has his own path that he is paved for himself in the service of God. And they're all different. This one emphasizes prayer. That one emphasizes charity. That one emphasizes learning Torah. That one emphasizes keruv rechokim. That one emphasizes the chesed, the importance of doing kindness to others. They all have their paths which they have paved for themselves. Now, if someone comes to the great rabbi and asks for advice, what is the path that I should go upon in order to serve God? What's the best path? Each of the great rabbis will say, do it like I did it. I got to where I am. I reached my high level of spirituality by learning Torah day and night, study Gemara. That's what you should do. You want the path? The path is study Torah. And go to the other great rabbi and ask him, what's the path I should take in order to rise to a level of spirituality like yours? He'll say, do it like I did it. Chesed. Every opportunity you have in your life, devote to doing acts of kindness for others. That's how I reached my high level of spirituality, and if you want to follow the path, that's what you should do. The other one who reached this high level of spirituality through performing acts of charity recommends charity. Each of the great rabbis, if you ask them what is the correct path, they'll all recommend the path that they took to get there. And that is what Yisro wanted for his grandson. Yisro came to Torah and mitzvahs from idolatry, and that's exactly the path that he wanted for his grandson, and that is why he insisted with Moshe Rabbeinu that Moshe's first son be raised as an idolater. For various technical reasons, Moshe Rabbeinu was not obligated to follow this advice and did not actually do it. The point of the Sfas Emes is there are many paths, and each rabbi recommends his own. There are those who have taken the path of astrology, and their understanding of Torah and mitzvahs is rooted in astrological wisdom, as portrayed to us in this one example. In the Or Einayim, we understand the relationship between Mars and blood, and the relationship between the constellation of the Ram and the commandment of Bris Milah, and so forth and so on. And this understanding, this path, will strengthen you in your commitment to Torah and mitzvahs, and that's a path which the astrologers took to get to a high level of spirituality in Torah, and that's the path that they would advise you to take as well. On the other hand, we also saw the approach of the Rambam and those rabbis who totally, absolutely, and completely reject the validity of authority. They climbed the spiritual ladder through a different path, through the path of learning, through other paths, and they will recommend that you follow their path in order to get there. Bottom line, what we are left with are different paths which lead to the same goal, to the same result. Ultimately, everyone agrees that what is important is Torah and mitzvahs. The only question is, what's the best way to motivate a person to move ahead in the engagement in Torah and mitzvahs? Some people, like the Or Einayim, which we have just looked at, think the best way to move someone forward in the engagement in Torah and mitzvahs is to explain things astrologically. Others, we have seen, reject this approach, and they hold that the best way to move someone forward in the engagement in Torah and mitzvahs is through learning Mishnah, Gemara, Talmudic wisdom, and so forth and so on. Everyone is going to have to choose their own path. As long as you are on the path of engagement in Torah and mitzvahs, you're surely on the right path, and all is well. With this, we come to the end of this class and the end of this series of classes. Beginning next week, I'm going to be giving a series of mini classes in the Web Yeshiva, one mini series dealing with drunkenness on Purim, one mini series dealing with women reading the Megillah of Purim. I will also be giving a mini-series on medications on Pesach, the problem of medications, which might include chametz on Pesach. And I will be giving a fourth mini-series on the question of mourning, the foundation of mourning during Sfiras HaOmer, the elements of mourning, the things we refrain from doing during Sfiras HaOmer between Pesach and Shavuos. Until then, I wish you a good week and a Shabbat Shalom, and look forward to seeing you all again in the next semester, beginning next week, the next semester of the Web Yeshiva with our new topics. Until then, Shalom, Shalom.